Well, here we are. Welcome back to room one. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break, and we are ready to go on with the agenda for this morning. Now, the next speaker is Neil Bullock. I am very glad to introduce him to you. From Lancaster University, Neil is a teacher trainer, and test developer working with aviation and business English. His presentation will analyze the results of a survey carried out within the aviation world and related to see the impact of COVID in this specific context from the perspective, of course, of both learning and testing system. So, redressing the balance post-COVID, the challenges for the workplace language proficiency assessment, a case study in the aviation environment. Please, Neil, the virtual floor is for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and a very good morning to everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And first of all, a big thanks to Nick and his team at Alti for bringing all this together in what clearly are very challenging times for all of us in many different ways. So it's great to be here and just to share some experiences from another particular domain of language assessment, particularly in the aviation world. I've been involved in languages for a little under 20 years, both through aviation for most of my professional life. And as Lorenzo said, I'm currently undergoing research in assessment of the communication skills required in aviation testing over and above language. So there's a little snapshot of the kind of things that I've been involved in over the years. And although I'm an independent consultant, I also represent the International Civil Aviation English Association, which is an association which works with the International Civil Aviation Organization in teaching and testing of aviation English. So just to give you a very brief overview, and we'll come on to this when we look at the actual challenges that we've had in an aviation language. The system was set up in the beginning of this century and came into operation in 2008 to assess language proficiency. And one of the things that's always interested me is the fact that language proficiency is not just one element of the communication process. It's part of multiple factors. So it's more than just language itself. And this is really what I'm working on now in terms of my own research. So I'll be looking at things like communicative competence, task-based language assessment, the notion of quality in testing, and also in terms of authenticity and what's often referred to as indigenous criteria. So how do the actual people who are being assessed, what do they see? What do they want to actually see in the assessment process? So what I'm going to look at very quickly is just go through an overview of what the process that we have in aviation. And then I'm going to, as Lorenzo mentioned, go on to just look at some research that I've done recently in surveys in terms of what tests are actually available and how that matches the challenges that we face in this domain. And then also look at a small survey that I did with test users during the last 12 to 14 months of the COVID situation, and just to look at how things have actually changed. So in my own world at the moment, I am based in Switzerland, and we've been very fortunate here that we haven't had too much too many lockdown problems, and that we've been able to maintain, with the exception of two relatively short periods, face-to-face teaching and face-to-face assessment, albeit, of course, with social distancing, having to disinfect material, and of course, wearing of masks in both lessons and both in assessment centres. So, of course, the challenges, as I'm sure most of you are aware of course, has been how it's affected students and test takers, how we've been obliged to work with technology. The fact that the environment in which we work in has changed so much, and having to adapt to those challenges, I think, has been one of the hardest parts for everybody, I think, in the last 12 to 14 months. Just to put this into perspective, the pictures that I've shown there are from Geneva Airport, and you can see there's a definite lack of aeroplanes and a definite lack of passengers. And this, of course, has been reflected around the world in the last 12 months. And there's just some figures there on the screen from the European Union as to how aviation has been impacted by the COVID crisis. So a huge drop in traffic, a huge drop in passengers, and a slight increase in cargo. And those figures are from February this year. And as we were just discussing earlier on, I think Barry and Linda were talking about the carbon footprint. Certainly that has been reduced as maybe a positive effect of what's happened in the last 12 months. But of course, it's part of a whole global problem. But of course, within that situation, we still need to maintain pilots and air traffic controllers' language skills. And we still need to make sure that they are still current and they're valid to be able to operate as they would do under normal circumstances. So the system itself in aviation, we came into operation around 2008, and it was set up to assess language proficiency for essentially pilots, most commercial pilots around the world, and air traffic controllers, because it was seen that from research there were many incidents and accidents where plain language proficiency in aviation was problematic and was a causal factor in many incidents and accidents. So we only assess speaking and listening, because they're the two main skills that are used between pilots and controllers. It was based on 5 holistic descriptors. We have 6 levels, not dissimilar to the CEFR, but very focused on the aviation communications environment. And we assess 6 skills. We assess pronunciation, fluency, vocabulary, structure comprehension, and interaction. And in order for a pilot or a controller to be valid, they need to have an operational level 4 in all of the 6 skills. So it's not an average or an aggregate-based score. And the oversight is given to national authorities around the world. And here in Europe, that is governed by EU law under the EASA, which is the aviation agency from the European Union. So, of course, communication between pilots and controllers is governed most of the time by what we call standard phraseology. So this is a coded and fixed language which facilitates communication in most routine situations. But of course, as we all know, in many aspects of life, not just in aviation, routine situations do become problematic from time to time. And this is where the plain language element comes into it. So in the little graphic that I put on the screen there, you can see that the idea of standard phraseology is really the core element of communication. And then it's supported by a specific purpose, very technical language, and again by general purpose language to form this kind of fusion of phraseology and plain language when problematic situations do arrive. And of course, like any new system, there have been challenges over the years. And I've just put 1 or 2 up on the screen here. And I'll go through them relatively quickly, but these are also covered in a chapter of a book which was published quite recently on testing around the world. One of the problems that we found is that the system was set up, we struggled to find any empirical evidence for the rating scale that's used, for the justification of some of the theory in that's used. It tends to very much a native speaker role model. And of course, this is problematic when we look at English used as a lingua franca, which is essentially what this is supposed to be worldwide. The 6th level, if you like, the sort of equivalent of C2, requires no retesting and is very much based on native speaker bias. And of course, one of the problems that we've seen with that is accommodation skills for speakers of a lower level of proficiency. And I've seen that in a few examples where potentially monolingual native speakers of English have had to struggle to communicate with a level 4 speaker who actually is able to use their strategic skills to affect the communication. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. We have problems with oversight. We have problems with assessment literacy. Barry mentioned earlier on about stakeholders and how important it is to bring on board all stakeholders. And getting that message across of assessment literacy has been quite hard. The system's very test dominated. There's very much a negative washback effect. People just want to pass the test, which is a great shame because we're talking about safety and we're talking about the need to have skills. Perhaps one of the things that I've seen, and this has led me to undertake the research and the doctoral research, which I'm doing at the moment, and that is face validity. The fact that many operators, because the system itself is very language-based, they see that it doesn't really touch on all the communication skills and the operational elements that they have in aviation. So there is this disconnect between the system and what actually happens in real life. And of course, that in itself is problematic. But of course, it's not all negative, and I don't want to frighten people away from flying because it's certainly not as gloomy as it might seem. But of course, one of the things that it has done, it has created an awareness of language and communication in many parts of the world, and the importance of having a good level of language proficiency. So quickly moving on now to some of the projects and the research that is providing some of the data this morning. One of the things that I've been involved in recently was a project called the Test Development Guidelines, which we at ACAO developed with the support of ACAO, and this was delivered around the world, giving workshops essentially to aviation authorities and test service providers. And it was, if you like, an assessment literacy project to give them an idea about what is actually needed in a good test. And that's still work in progress. We're working with ACAO at the moment to produce documentation to support that. And it was based essentially on 8 test design criteria. And we explained what all these meant. We were able to show workshop participants what, using examples from real tests, what were not addressing the key skills and how these 8 individual criteria addressed the skills that were required. Just recently, as well, as part of my research, I've also included just a brief snapshot looking at the tests that are out there, and it doesn't make for particularly good reading. And those of you who would have received the link yesterday, I think it was Graham that sent it out, there is a paper included in the Madrid conference papers, which actually looks at this survey. So if you are interested in that, then do have a look at the paper that can be downloaded from the ALTI website. And again, some of the things which the survey pointed out, which were there online, people talking about their success rate, the interaction was just very single utterances. Test taker had to react with a computer, not another person as they would do in real life, often very decontextualized, overuse of picture descriptions, and just, again, some of the elements that come out of the survey there, looking at the poor quality of some of the tests that are out there. And of course, these are some of the challenges that we faced. And again, they're available on the paper that you can download from the ALTI website. So I'm going to move on then to a survey which I carried out just recently. And this is looking at the effects of COVID on the language proficiency testing in aviation. It was done quite quickly, and I only managed to get replies from 20 participants, although they were spread within 15 countries. Only 5% of those that were surveyed were actually doing online testing pre-COVID, and only 10% have migrated to online testing since COVID actually started. And 88% said there's been no change. 84% actually suspended testing for a period. We did that here in Switzerland when all the test centres were closed, and the regional Civil Aviation Authority extended licence deadlines to take account of that. So that in itself was reassuring for those who needed to renew their language proficiency, and as well as other elements of their licensing. Everybody saw a reduction in sessions, okay, and quite a lot of those surveyed, like us here, once the lockdown was reduced, then they were able to open the test centres again. And of course, a lot of these things have been very challenging for all involved. And as we've been talking about this morning, how do we actually adapt to all of this? So the move to online has not been, again, without its problems. We're using commercially available software like Zoom, Skype, Teams, etc. I think, again, something in the group we were talking about in Linda's session before was proctoring and test security. And that is very, very important, I think, to think about in terms of it facilitates testing, of course, if people can do it from their home or a hotel or an office rather than having to go into a testing center. So the overall effect, which was really interesting, was relatively neutral. There were positives and there were negatives. And I think, as well from what we've seen this morning, that we're very much still in a transitory stage, and the future is still very much unknown. And it was nice to see Linda's positive attitude before, when she was talking about the excitement of the future. And I'm usually a very positive and optimistic person, so I'd like to think that as we move forward, that we can take some of the positive elements from this. And it's not all been negative, of course, but perhaps looking at these kind of things and using this kind of data and this kind of information to move our system forward, as we will need to do in the coming times. So very briefly, just to finish off then, the effects for the future. Integrating artificial intelligence, reduction in time and manpower, perhaps more training and testing, involving technology more in test administration, and hopefully a better design of online tests. It's still a big worry that it's used to facilitate things rather than looking at the qualitative aspect of what we're actually using. And of course, addressing the negative problems as well, which we have there. So I think for the future in testing, particularly in ESP and aviation, we need to address the issues. And I think we have to adapt to the changes that are happening around us. We need to do a lot more research, particularly in aviation. We need to bring in the operational specialists and get them working with the language people together to address this disconnect. And I think we should be ready to look at things differently all the time. We've all had to adapt a lot in the last 12 months. And I think that's been positive as well as negative. So let's hope in moving forward that we can take the positive aspects and address the negative aspects at the same time. So thank you all for watching. It's been a pleasure to be here.